Hey y'all, we are on page 112 through 115 of the Visual Encyclopedia. So one reason cities grew so rapidly in the late 1800s is that immigrants came to the United States in record numbers. Cities could not absorb so many people so fast, and the poor suffered from a lack of basic services. So you got to imagine, right, if you've got this town and you have 5 doctors and all of a sudden you have 5 times as many people, there's not enough doctors for that many people. And the people without money are going to be the ones that are going to suffer the quickest. Government was slow to respond, so private groups provided badly needed help. So many poor people in Southern and Eastern Europe envisioned America as a land where the streets were paved with gold. Desperate to escape the poverty of their homelands, they made their way to America. 9 million immigrants between 1880 and 1900, 9 million in 10 years. And 14.5 million more from 1900 to 1920. In the past, most immigrants had come from Western European countries like Great Britain and Germany, but this new wave was different. They came from Eastern European countries such as Poland and Russia, and from Southern Europe, especially Italy. Italians made up the largest immigrant group. Jews, many facing religious persecution, were the next largest. The influx of newcomers changed the makeup of the cities. They helped boost the population of New York City to 3 million by 1900. More than 1/3 of that number, 1.26 million, had been born outside the United States. The nation's largest cities absorbed the most immigrants, so that in 1900, 1 out of every 12 Americans lived in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago. That's incredible. Like, the majority of people were living in the cities. And there's Mulberry Street, which we had just seen in our previous reading, which was the center of Italian immigrant life in New York City. And then we've got this guy, Jacob Riis, I'm thinking is how you pronounce his name. Many middle and upper class families knew little about immigrants' problems. So Jacob Riis, who was a Danish immigrant and a photographer and journalist, exposed the suffering experienced by many immigrants. He had a book published, How the Other Half Lives, which helped people realize that government action was necessary to improve conditions in the city slums. And remember, we learned about tenement houses in our previous thing. And this says here, how are we to care for the poor and suffering? The book appears to favor government involvement, noting that the government was slow to respond, so private groups provided help. But this is actually a really good question, right? Is the government in charge of providing that help, or should we as people be providing that help? And I think most of us would say that we hope our families and local people will help with some of that as well. So coping with poverty, most of the immigrants arrived, and this looks like this page is just a little bit blurry, but I think you guys can read it, with little or no money, hoping to find work, even though they had few skills outside of farming and usually spoke no English. The majority were forced to live in slum conditions, really poor conditions, often in hastily constructed tenements, which we learned about, tall, narrow wooden buildings, poorly lighted and ventilated, with maybe a water faucet in the yard. In New York City in the late 1800s, and if we haven't read about it, we are going to. Sometimes I do the videos out of order, and I can't remember if you've read them, but we're going to, if you haven't, let's see. It's another video on tenement houses. It's going to be this week, so you've either watched it already or you're going to watch it. More than, anyways, there were 4,000 houses that had 1,000 people in them. Most cities had public water systems by 1890. Running water helped to eliminate epidemics of cholera and yellow fever, but large numbers of people living in unclean, cramped conditions turned tuberculosis into a major slum disease. City governments simply could not keep up with the great number of people, and never before had they been called upon to deal with such huge amounts of sewage and garbage. And this is a garment worker, just, earning not very much money, but working on sewing things. So people began to demand government action, but the response was slow. Individuals and private organizations found ways to make a difference. In 1889, Jane Addams, who either we learned about or are going to learn about, I can't remember. Let me see what chapter Jane Addams was in, so I can see if you guys have already read about her or not. So she was in our other book, The Landmark History of the American People. Let's see, that was chapter 15. Okay. So yeah, you should have done that today, right? So you're reading some of this stuff today. And let's see, Jane Addams, I think she's going to be chapter 17. So I think you're going to read more about her maybe tomorrow or the next day. So you're going to get more about them. So Jane Addams opened up Hull House, and I have a video that you're going to watch of that if you haven't already. Sorry about not knowing which order you're doing this in. based on the English idea of settlement houses, where the poor could find help. Settlement workers showed women how to care for the sick and how to shop for American food. Workers gave classes in English, sewing, dozens of other subjects. Churches and synagogues also became involved and set up welfare agencies. The Salvation Army provided meals, lodging, and prayer. Although conditions seemed overwhelming for some, most immigrants remained optimistic. City schools offered classes day and night, providing training in English, citizenship, nutrition, and job skills. Newcomers continued to believe in the dream of a better life, if not for themselves and for their children. We also had immigrants coming from China, and that started with the California Gold Rush, because where China is, when you leave China, it's quicker to come over to the California side, the west coast side of the United States. About 10,000 Chinese worked on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. By the 1870s, many white workers resented the Chinese, especially since they were often willing to work for lower wages than whites. Anti-Chinese feelings led to riots by mobs. Congress responded to the demands of politicians in California by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act, which ended Chinese immigration until it was repealed in 1943. So we actually said, no, the Chinese can't come over, which is really interesting that we felt that way about that. I didn't really know that very much, that we were like that against the Chinese coming in. So the struggles of labor. With large-scale industrial production, work grew impersonal, not very personal, right? We're just doing work, but we're not actually seeing the customers and being with them. Workers hoped to counter management's power by banding together and forming unions, even going on strike if their demands were not met. And we've talked about unions, or will be talking more about unions. But the owners had far more power and often used the police or military to break strikes and weaken unions. In the past, workers and owners had labored together in small shops. Now, in the late 1800s, employers toiled in huge factories, taking orders from managers. Jobs were tedious. Workers performed the same operation over and over, 10 to 12 hours a day, without the satisfaction of having completed something. So you're just putting in the same part, but you're never seeing the completed product. Owners of factories and mines paid little attention to employees' health or safety. Not only adults, but children too, stood for hours operating dangerous machines or breathing dust or foul air. Laborers who were injured or became too ill to work were fired, and permanently disabled workers received no help or wages. And we talked about sweatshops, or we will talk about sweatshops. In slum tenements, people labored in what were called sweatshops. They were paid for each completed item or piecework rather than by the hour. Sometimes entire families would work 12-hour days sewing garments or making paper flowers for little money because the pay per item was low. People had to work long hours to make enough money. Labor unions and strikes. So workers tried to form unions and to gain power with collective bargaining, talking to owners as a group about their needs. The owners found ways to get back, such as the blacklist, sharing names of union organizers with other owners, and the lockout, which would fire workers who were on strike. Remember, we talked about strikes and how all that works. In 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and 3 other railroad companies announced a 10% pay cut, and 100,000 workers across the country walked off their jobs. The striking workers became violent and destroyed millions of dollars worth of property, derailed trains, and burned rail yards. The owners asked the government for help, and police, state militia, and federal troops helped to end the strike. Americans were horrified by the disturbance that the workers caused, and the public opinion largely supported the owners. Okay, and then here's our last page of this section, page 115. The Homestead Strike of 1892. In 1886, 300,000 members from various trade unions joined together to form the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. When the union representing steelworkers went on strike against Carnegie's steel homestead plant, the owner's agent, Henry Frick, locked out the workers and hired 300 men from Pinkerton Detective Agency to enforce the lockout and protect non-union replacement, or scabs, they would call them. So when the union says, we're not working because you're not paying enough, sometimes the employers would then hire what they called scabs, who were people that would work for less, even though they were kind of like almost attacked by the people. It was so insulting to them that these other people would come in and take their jobs. So they even hired like police officers basically to protect the guys that would come in and work while the union was out. Let's see if I can find a good video about that. A bitter fight resulted. 7 guards and 9 strikers were killed. And after nearly 6 months, the lockout ended. Thousands lost their job, and the steel workers union was destroyed. The Pullman strike of 1894. The Pullman Company in Illinois, a manufacturer of luxury railroad cars, operated a company town, meaning that it required its workers to live in Pullman housing and buy food and necessities at the Pullman store. In 1893, Pullman cut wages by 25 to 40%, but did not lower its rent or store prices. In May of 1894, the American Railway Union went on strike. Strike breakers were brought in, followed by the militia. In the summer of 1894, President Grover Cleveland ordered Army troops in, and the strike was finally crushed. The loss in this strike convinced many workers that unions could not help them. And there's a picture of the Homestead strikers there in the top left, and then the Haymarket riot, which is going to be in our other section that you've either done or are going to do. And that began when police were called to break up a strike at the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company in Chicago. One worker was killed and several others wounded. The next day, people gathered to protest the police violence. When the police arrived to break up the meeting, someone threw a bomb, which killed 7 police officers and wounded many more. Police opened fire, injuring dozens. Although the Knights of Labor, then one of the largest unions, was blamed for the riot, their involvement had never been proven. And then we've got some labor organizers over here. We've got Samuel Gompers, and he became let's see. As a young immigrant, he enjoys his factory experience as a cigar maker. Gompers and his fellow workers took turns, having one person read aloud while the others rolled cigars. And then they would share the finished output with the reader. So that's kind of fun. They would have a reader so that they weren't so bored sitting there rolling cigars. That's actually a really interesting idea. He helped form the American Federation of Labor. The union grew, and Gompers remained the head of it for 40 years. Although unions were weak at the turn of the century, their membership increased and got stronger. And then there was Mother Jones. Mary Harris Mother Jones was an Irish immigrant who worked for more than 40 years as a labor organizer, mostly for the United Mine Workers. She was so successful that they called her the most dangerous woman in America. She lost her husband and 4 children in a yellow fever epidemic. She moved to Chicago and worked as a seamstress, but she lost all her belongings in the Great Chicago Fire. So she became a labor organizer after the fire and spent much of her time on the road until she retired at 95, living quietly until her death at the age of 100. That's pretty cool too. So this will go hand in hand, like I said, with the other assignment. And it'll just depend on which one you watch first to see how much you sort of understand what's going on. Okay.